Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening this time. I think we have speakers joining us from different parts of the world and the audience as well. So welcome to December edition of the Data Talk series organized by the Data Innovation Lab at the German Federal Foreign Office. Today's discussion centers on this important topic of the Global Digital Compact, from vision to action, key takeaways, and future directions. My name is Branka Panic, and I'm a senior advisor to the Data Innovation Lab, and it's a pleasure to have you joining the conversation today. Before we dive in, let me take a moment first to introduce our hosts today. Launched in 2023 by the German Federal Foreign Office and managed by the GovTech Campus Germany, the Data Innovation Lab is dedicated to shaping a future where human-centered and data-driven insights empower sustainable development, foster technological innovation, and strengthen global cooperation. This platform brings together a diverse community, uniting experts in foreign policy, but also civil society organizations, different UN experts and UN agencies, local stakeholders, tech innovators, private sector, and academia to tackle pressing challenges in data and AI. The lab serves as a space for exploring different ideas, for piloting innovative data and AI solutions, and advancing foreign policy initiatives. It is committed to promoting ethical practices, driving multilateral efforts, and building bridges between technology and foreign policy. Through these monthly data talks, the lab aims to raise awareness among foreign policy professionals about the transformative potential of data science, AI, and other emerging technologies. And previous sessions covered the diversity of topics related to AI ethics, data colonialism, sustainability, data spaces, election and AI, and more. And if you missed any of these discussions, they're available on the Data Innovation Lab YouTube channel and website for you to explore further. Our topic today is Global Digital Compact. On 22nd of September 2024, world leaders convened in New York for the Summit of the Future, where they adopted the Pact for the Future that includes a Global Digital Compact, GDC. GDC was introduced, and I quote, as a comprehensive framework for global governance of digital technology and AI. And following this really big milestone, the pressing question is now, what comes next? And to answer this question, today's data talk convenes experts from the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, the UNSG High-Level Advisory Body on AI, and leading voices from civil society, academia, government, and industry to explore this question of what comes next. Participants will gain insights into the GDC's purpose, commitments, and priorities, but we especially look forward to exploring practical strategies for turning the GDC into action and discovering ways to actively contribute to this process. How can we contribute? And when I say we, I don't mean only the Data Innovation Lab, but all of us in the audience as well. So welcome to the audience. I still see people joining. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and to tell us where you're joining us from and what brings you to the topic of GDC. So with this, it's my great pleasure to also introduce our speakers, guest panelists today. Renata Doan, Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, a leading voice supporting the elaboration of the Global Digital Compact, just as I said, recently approved by the member states at the UN Summit of the Future. So Renata, I can't imagine a better person to actually guide us through the process. So thank you so much for joining the panel. Nigat Dad, Executive Director of the Digital Rights Foundation Pakistan, member of the UNSG High-Level AI Advisory Body, another body that played a really crucial role around these conversations, especially around data and AI. And also with these connections with the GDC, Nigat, we really look forward to hear from you, your insights, and also plans for the future. and Linda Bonio, founder of the Lawyers Hub and member of the World Economic Forum's Global Council on Technology Policy, our third speaker and panelist today, who I believe joining us from Kenya, a country that played a really crucial role in the negotiations, in preparations, and we hope will take this role further as well in bringing the GDC to practice. So really look forward to hearing not only from Kenya perspective, but maybe broader as well. We would like to have this conversation with contributions from Africa, but global South as well. So with this, I will open now the introductions, maybe to give a couple of minutes time for each of our speakers to actually introduce themselves directly. I barely touched upon your bios and amazing work that you're doing in this space. So I will give you the space to introduce yourselves, to explain our audience how is your work connected to the GDC. And then I have a specific opening question for each one of you. And then maybe starting with Renata. Renata, to those in the audience who are fairly new to the GDC, can you help them understand the bigger idea behind its creation? Maybe how the negotiations process unfolded. There was a huge negotiation process organized, very transparent and inclusive in the entire process. And then, of course, what are the outcomes that the GDC has delivered? Let's start with what happened until the Summit of the Future and at the Summit of the Future. And then in the second part of the conversation, we'll talk more about the next steps. So I'm opening the floor first with Renata. Welcome, Renata.
Great. Great to be with you, Branka, today. Thank you for the very clear and coherent introduction. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are, to everybody online today. And great to be with Nigat and Linda. I think certainly with Linda, we've been on a few panels over this journey. So I'm going to, as Branka suggested, give a little bit about how did we get here, and then really keen to hear your perspectives on how do we go forward as well. And indeed, feel free to add your perspectives on some of the things I'll touch on the origins and the negotiations of the GDC. So what is the Global Digital Compact? I would say first, it is perhaps new hint to that already, Branka. It's the first comprehensive global framework for digital cooperation. We have many agreements, but they're often sectoral and issue-specific, human rights and digital technologies, or aspects of cybersecurity, or aspects of trust and safety. We have, of course, the World Summit on Information Society, that really critical World Summit initiated by the UN 2 decades ago. But that was very much focused on the internet and the information society. And really, the ensuing 2 decades has seen, of course, an enormous transformation in digitalization. And how do we catch up and reflect that? So really, that's what the GDC is, this global framework to set the principles, the issues, and the priorities for strengthening digital cooperation. A feature of it, I would say, is that it takes a holistic approach to digital technology governance. So I think inherent in the idea of it being this comprehensive framework is the idea that progress in one area, for example, digital public infrastructure, really can only take place if you've got the other building blocks. So universal connectivity, sufficient digital capacities and skills for people to be able to use the digital public infrastructure. And then, of course, trust and safety aspects and dimensions being really addressed. So that holistic approach, I think, is going to be very important when we look at the data and AI dimensions of the GDC. The third feature of it, I guess, I would highlight is that it commits governments, but all participating stakeholders. It very much is opened to non-state stakeholders for endorsement, for participation, for signing up to commitments and actions. It sets out a set of concrete actions for improved digital cooperation, and that includes a number of follow-up steps to track progress. Now, I'm framing all of these 3 points, but of course, the yin of those yangs, or the yangs of those yins, is of course a document that tries to address many issues, doesn't address any specific issue in great depth. And second, I think it's fair to say that in the negotiations, and I'll say a few words about them, some of the more specific and ambitious actions and targets were slightly watered down, as is perhaps always the case with these multilateral negotiation processes. But be that as it may, I think what it stands out for, and perhaps in distinction from WISs, are some of the concrete actions, and including a follow-up and progress review mechanism. So very briefly, Branka, I won't go into detail on this so that we can keep the forward-looking perspective, but you asked a little bit about the origins. I think the origins stem even from before COVID-19, the pandemic. The Secretary General had launched a series of panels on digital technologies, a roadmap for digital technologies, and I think was very much the sense that technology governance had to become a core feature of multilateralism, both because of its significance for all other pillars of, let's say, multilateralism, peace, security, human rights, development, but also as a driver of potential conflict, as a contributor to tensions, and obviously in our geopolitical rivalry that we see today, we see digital issues around supremacy and dominance in critical strategic aspects of technology being considered very important in that perspective. So I think even before we saw COVID, the Secretary General was talking about a much more, I think, upgraded multilateralism. But COVID then really did reveal and highlight for all of us the power and the peril of our digital world. Those with access, with connectivity, with skills, with the infrastructure required, were able to survive, manage, and even flourish in the digital space. During the pandemic, for other societies, that absence really fell back and represented critical challenges to the sustainment of societies, provision of services, and economic development. So really, I think COVID, was a driver in what was already a sense that we needed to put digital technology governance at the heart of multilateralism for the 21st century. And then I would just add to that, the arrival to market, the launch to market of ChatGPT in 2023 really, I think, turbocharged the discussions, because those diplomats that were engaged in the process all of a sudden were mindful or conscious that this technology had captured public imagination, captured public debate. Every country was having debates on what does this mean for the future of work, for the future of trust society, for economic equity and fairness and markets, etc. So really, I think, lent it an actuality that perhaps otherwise it might not have had. You mentioned, Branka, the negotiation process. So let me say just a few words on that. I think first, the negotiation process was lengthy. We agreed this document at the Summit of the Future. Member states, leaders of the world agreed this on this document as part of their Pact for the Future. But the discussions of a global digital compact began in January, February 2023. So you really did have 18 months of consultations. The second feature I would flag is that you had 18 months of consultations, of which 14 of them were multi-stakeholder. And I'll come to this tension between the intergovernmental process aspect and versus the multi-stakeholder requirement, if you're going to look at technology governance, why you need to have non-state actors in the room, and why it is so particularly critical in that area. But I think we saw that tension play out. And when member states agreed to negotiate a global digital compact, they highlighted specifically that it would be intergovernmentally negotiated. But I think the UN, and I would here highlight the co-facilitators, the ambassadors of Sweden and Zambia, really worked to try to keep that process as multi-stakeholder as possible for as long as possible. So it began in February 2023, concluded in September 2024, and up until April, when member states started negotiating actual texts, it was multi-stakeholder. A couple of things I would just highlight was features of this, and I think these points are important as we think about digital technology governance going forward. First, you are dealing with an issue that has a technical issue, a political issue, a strategic issue, and a human rights dimension. They all bring different sectors of expertise. But there's a process of learning there where diplomats need to learn a sufficient language and understanding of the technical issues to engage, and the technical community needs to familiarize itself with the multilateral process, diplomatic processes. So we had a series of informal consultations for the first year that included deep dives on specific topics, that included an open online call for consultations where we had over 5,000 contributions, where we had regional consultations in Addis, Mexico, India, participation in the Internet Governance Forum's annual meeting, WSIS Forum, AI for Good. So a mixture of trying to use existing digital frameworks and processes, having specific regional mechanisms, and then offering space to as much a variety of voices as you could get to try to facilitate both a learning but also an exchange. And I think that exchange was helpful in enabling the technology community to hear some of the political perspectives, and very importantly, the political diplomatic perspective to be hearing from the civil society, technical and other experts. I'll just throw out one example. References to mental health in the text were not inserted in the original drafts. They were not pushed forward by member states. That was voices from civil society that really advocated for that issue. Similarly, there was a very strong and organized contribution by child safety networks and alliances that brought that factor in that was really a critical dimension on the GDC. And then, so what I would then just offer is the idea that because of that long set of negotiations, when it came to negotiations on the drafts, you didn't have questioning of the fundamental issues as why is this issue being addressed? Why are we talking about this factor? You were able to discuss about the issues in it. And I think that helped the negotiations between April and September. Now, I'll just conclude by a couple of themes to really highlight perhaps what's in some of the key issues in those negotiations. And Linda and Nigat, I'm sure you'll have many more perspectives. I think first was the idea of development versus human rights perspectives. Now, I want to stress that in the UN and at the heart of multilateralism is the idea that democracy and human rights or development and human rights, are co-dynamic and interdependent. You can't have one without the other. The UN is very clear on. But there is a tension currently in many multilateral fora to see these as a dichotomy or as an either or. And I think that's problematic. But certainly a key theme for many actors was that any digital cooperation needed to be front and center located in the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was really a big driver. That led sometimes to some opposition to addressing newer issues like artificial intelligence. Initially, some from the Global South felt we need to focus on long-standing problems like connectivity and digital skill sets and capacities before we move on to newer issues. I think that evolved over time, but that tension was there. A second kind of key theme in the negotiations was digital sovereignty, rooted in discussions over the role of the state in driving digital transformation versus the role of bottom-up multi-stakeholder participation. And that came through in the notion of intergovernmental versus multi-stakeholder models of cooperation. Happy to talk about that in the break. I think another key negotiation discussion was whether AI as a general purpose technology and AI governance should be framed in terms of opportunity or risk. And here I think the Global South, many representatives of developing countries felt very strongly that the issue of AI, the promise of AI, and then AI governance should be presented in terms of the opportunities it provides for countries to leapfrog in their development, not as a risk. And I think there was some fears that this will be a sort of those who entered into the AI space will close the door behind them, and that technology would be not accessible to developing countries. And then finally, I'll just point out a key issue in the discussions that really emerged over the course of the discussions was data governance as a development and a justice concern. I think there were many, many entry points to the discussion of data governance. The questions that were known to multilateral fora in the UN was very much around privacy rights, trust and security, issues around data capacity of states to track their sustainable development journey. But then these newer issues around data liabilities, value generation, share, implications of synthetic data were very much on the agenda. And my sense is that there still isn't a consensus on what, where, and how data governance might be addressed at the multilateral level, but a sense that it needs to be addressed with some urgency. So it's a starting point rather than a finishing point. So I will stop here, but I will flag that GDC is available online for those of you who haven't seen it. It's structured around principles of digital cooperation. For some, that's the most important aspect. There are 5 objectives to digital cooperation, balance of, as I said, these older issues of connectivity and these newer issues, data and AI governance. It includes commitments and actions, and it includes follow-up steps that involve, inter alia, member states coming back together in 4 years from now at the 82nd session of the General Assembly to review progress in the implementation of those actions and frameworks. It's a non-binding agreement. It's open to endorsement of all stakeholders, private sector, local governments, regional authorities, civil society organizations, and its decentralized implementation, I think, offers scope for different actors to indicate and where they seek to contribute and how they might do so. I'll stop here and very happy to have a chat on any or all aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata, for such a comprehensive overview. In only 10 minutes, you managed to guide us through such a long process of GDC. And you pointed and maybe gave a really good introduction to pass the floor to our next speakers, pointing to this element of data governance and especially AI, and AI perceived as a risk or an opportunity. And we have our next guest who I think is such a perfect person to actually talk about these elements of the GDC, but more from this perspective of her role in the AI advisory body. So Nika, the question for you, first to introduce yourselves to the audience and then to tell us more about this body for maybe parts of our audience that were not familiar of how this body was established and maybe what this specific relationship to the GDC process was. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Branka, and thank you, Renata, for setting the stage so well. So for the audience, my name is Nigat Dad, and I am from Pakistan by training. I'm a lawyer, and I run a nonprofit called Digital Rights Foundation. And I have been part of different processes, not at the UN, but when it comes to platform accountability and other digital rights issues. But with regards to this particular topic, specifically around AI, UN Secretary General's AI High-Level Advisory Body, the vision basically for the Global Digital Compact was outlined in the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report. And according to the report, the GDC basically what Renata already mentioned, that could address reaffirming the fundamental commitments to connecting the unconnected, avoiding fragmentation of the internet, providing people with options as to how their data is used, applications of human rights online, promoting a trustworthy internet by introducing accountability criteria for discrimination and misleading content, and the regulation of artificial intelligence. And that's where our role basically comes in. So UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Body on AI was established in October 2023. We had 39 members, came from every continent, and including representatives from government, academia, civil society, and the tech industry. And I would say that this was the first genuinely global effort to govern AI and engage in the conversations. What we did after our establishment in October 2023, we engaged with estimated 2,000 plus experts and stakeholders. We had 250 written submissions from all over the world with regards to our work. we did 40 plus consultations in all regions and 16 deep dives on several issues that we identified that would be very useful for our interim report and eventually the final report. And all these efforts and engagements basically we basically did them to help us answer that why we need a global approach to govern AI, why only AI that, like this body is focused on with regards to the GDC process, and how proposals fit into emerging governance landscape. We released our it was a lot of work for us 39 members, and in just 2 months we released our interim report, which was AI governance AI governance report, and so the guiding principles for AI governance, where we basically some of the principles we laid out was AI should be governed inclusively by and for the benefit of all. We mentioned AI must be governed in the public interest. AI governance should be built in step with data governance and the promotion of data commons. There was another principle that AI governance must be universal, networked, and rooted in adaptive multi-stakeholder collaboration. And AI governance should be anchored in the UN Charter, international human rights law, and other agreed international commitments such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are very proud of our entire report and eventually the final report, which was released in during UN General Assembly in September. With all honesty, I was not really expecting that some of our recommendations will be so quickly negotiated by the member states, and actually some of our recommendations were adopted by the member states and became part of Global Digital Compact, which is, to be honest, a step forward in addressing the many divides that exist. And some of us from Global South, Global Majority, have been watching these conversations around AI governance or AI safety summits, and seeing all these events happening in the UK and US and Europe, and not really becoming Global Majority and Global South, not really being part of these conversations. So it seemed like as if Global North is deciding now on emerging tech and AI, that how the AI should look like for rest of the world. And I think that's what our report basically very visibly mentioned, that whether between the US or China or Europe and the Global South, or between governments or the private sector and the tech companies, like reaching these agreements really wasn't easy, even for us within our own advisory body. But it actually proved that how essential collective efforts are in this space. One of the recommendations that I'm very proud of is the establishment of an international scientific panel on AI, which has been approved in principle by member states and added into the GDC. The idea is it's very straightforward. It's like, if we want to govern something as complex as AI, we need a shared understanding of it first. So we have seen this play out with climate change. While there's still debate on how to tackle the crisis, the overwhelming evidence from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change leaves no need for action. An AI-focused panel could do the same, providing an independent, factual basis to guide global policy making and debates. And the second recommendation, which is also admitted principally, is to initiate within the United Nations a global dialogue on AI governance involving governments and all relevant stakeholders, which will take place in the margins of existing relevant United Nations conferences and meetings. I will stop here, and maybe in next conversations we can talk about that, how we see the implementation of these recommendations, and maybe a kind of roadmap that we imagine for next 12 months.
Thank you so much, Nika. This was very useful to hear about the broader idea behind the AI advisory body and specific contributions to the GDC. And in the next round, we will talk more about what to expect next in the terms of bringing all of these recommendations now to practice. But before that, let's hear from Linda first about your views on the entire process. We are always encouraging the critical views from civil society. We heard from Renata already how the entire process was inclusive, but it's still some things were left out of the process. So maybe also about some ideas how to bring back some of these conversations to the GDC in the next and following months, or whatever you would like to point, Linda, in this process now of reflecting of how the GDC actually looked like. We also welcome your voice as well, as I mentioned in the introduction, from somebody who is actually coming from Kenya and Africa to hear how this entire process reflects in your continent as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate that. And the previous speakers, Renata has, made some really great points, and I had the privilege to be part of the convenings with the Office of the Tech Envoy at the UN. I believe that this process was very inclusive. I had the privilege to be part of the discussions in Kenya, in India, as well as in New York. And that gave me a very different approach to, the policy priorities that different countries have, the different challenges that they face, and what they consider, quick takeaways, and the things that they could change. For context, my name is Linda Bonyo. I am the founder of the Lawyers Hub. And at the Lawyers Hub, we are working to bridge this tech divide. So we operate at the intersection of law and technology. As a Pan-African digital law organization, we are always working with both policymakers, but then also with startups. We run a startup accelerator, but then we also combine this with policy. We run the Africa Digital Policy Institutes. We believe that by working at this intersection, it gives us the opportunity to still look for the human rights angle, the development approach, which I think Renata spoke about, the different, priorities that people had on how do you balance, what each area is looking for, development, or are we looking for to do this, kill the gap. So in line with our mission, we recently launched the Africa's first AI Policy Lab, supported by the Patrick McGovern Foundation. It's a pioneering initiative that's dedicated to advancing responsible and impactful AI governance. We realize that there's a lot of data deficit. The GDC talks about this digital divide, and we see that there's a data divide. And in certain cases, this data deficit really persists in government. And so the lab serves as this platform for evidence-based thought leadership. And you can, we're trying to build sort of data sets around financial services, migration, which if you talk to a lot of the people who are coming in from the global south, we hear comments every single time that there's a focus on technology and how fast it can move, but there's no focus on humanity and how humanity can move around the world. We still have challenges around mobility and visas and things like that. And we think that, AI, for instance, exacerbates this divides and makes the discrimination systemized, which should not be. Our goal, I think, at this point is to look at how to close those digital divides beyond such processes. But I would like to just mention, I think, in terms of the GDC, coming from the zero draft until what we now have in text from the UN General Assembly, we had comments, I think, in our first thinking around the role of the International Telecommunications Union. We see with different policymakers, when there's a policy process, there's always the challenge on, are you creating a new body, and what happens to legacy institutions? And so in the zero draft, we made a comment on the role of the ITU, and that there will be, not having the ITU implement the GDC in that sense would bring some, great gap and in creating new institutions would bring some sort of duplicity. But there's also the second thing that I think we raised at that point was accountability frameworks, and Neda has talked about this. We needed a stronger and robust accountability framework within the GDC, to ensure that these commitments made within the compact are upheld, with mechanisms for monitoring, reporting, and addressing violations or shortcomings. We see that within the GDC that there is a call to tech companies, big tech companies, as well as software developers, to respect human rights and to come up with ways in which they can respect human rights within these platforms. So I think those are really gains that come from the GDC. I believe that the multi-stakeholder movement that the UN employed on this particular process made the voices heard, a lot of voices heard, and we see that this is within the GDC. And I'm not being nice. I think this is commendable in this day and age. The other issues I think that are really notable within the GDC is on agility. Africa, out of Africa's 34 data protection laws, 18 of them are near copy-pastes of the European global GDPR. Sorry, I'm on the global way, but on the data governance, Europe's GDPR. And this shows you that many countries can afford to change their policies, but Africa's policies we see are really still resting on colonial factors. But one of the main reasons is because of the cost of policy processes. It's not easy to change policy. It's not affordable. And so when I see the issues on agility, it means that governments must now begin to look at what are the agile ways in which we can transform policies, but then also have very multifaceted policies that could, be fit for purpose in several years rather than keep making this sort of amendments. The GDC refers to inclusion, and this commitment on closing the digital divide is useful. I think with the Tech Envoy's office, looking at the conversation, linking the conversation on the GDC with the AI conversation, as well as the DPI, which is the digital public infrastructure, I think is useful for the global south, because then now we close the connectivity divides that still behooves us. I'd also want to, comment on information integrity as a commitment coming from the GDC, which is useful. This was a big election year. They said more than half of the world had gone to elections this year. 16 African countries out of 55 had the elections this year. And we see the information ecosystem. If you follow the news on how many people, the exodus that's happening to Blue Sky and to other platforms, it tells you that more and more of these platforms really are facing a challenge on having either right-wingers or left-wingers. And then now you have information bubbles that really do not work well for the world. We need to have platforms where each and every person can fit and have this global conversation, what they have called, sorry, I forget the name, but I would say that information integrity, as pertains especially to elections, is something that really is great to consider as we look at this process. I think, in summary, the past process of the GDC has really shown the difference in the world and shown leadership in this time to get the world to commit to a global digital compact, a time when most of the world is either going through the ramifications of COVID. We have wars taking place all over. I think this was commendable. And finally, on interoperability, I believe that the GDC points out to interoperability, and I think the conversations that has been had within the AI report that's come out. The conversations I attended was on what do we do with open source and what does that look like? And are there open source standards in this particular ecosystem at this specific points? I believe that the conversation on interoperability helps the world and helps us to focus on this. And AI for humanity. I believe that as we have this AI race, arms race, we must look at what is AI for humanity and how do we close this. In Africa, the problem is compute. And that has been the problem with artificial intelligence, that we don't have the same computing power. We did hire an ML engineer, and he was joining us from Nigeria. And every day he complains that he has to apologize, that I'm sorry for, I went off and this happened. And some ecosystems will take this as, you're not serious about your job. But Nigeria hasn't had electricity. And many of the people are using generators. South Africa had the same problem, until last year. So half the world almost now, especially the global majority, does not have electricity. And so as we have these conversations about the GTC, I think what I learned in the process was we don't have the same lived experiences. And it's useful that we recognize that and we close these gaps, so that basic things like electricity, and looking at, for instance, only 1% of data centers exist in Africa compared to the rest of the world. Our AI policy lab, there were about, in our calculation, about 120 policy labs in Africa, in the world, and there was none in Africa. And that tells you that we aren't the same. So if we aren't the same, how do we get to a point that is agreeable? And I think the Global Digital Compact offered that opportunity for then governments to, have this sort of conversations and see what closing the digital divide means. The scientific panel on AI under the GDC is great to go, but then also the global dialogue on AI, I think is one of those continuing processes to see that how has this changed? How have things changed since we had the GDC? How have our realities and lived experiences changed in that particular sense? In the zero draft of the GDC, we made comments as to the global on data governance, and we thought that there should be some specificity around data governance in terms of the wording and the guidelines. And we are happy about the openness around data flows within the GDC and the interoperability of data within the Global Digital Compact. So those will be my comment on on the GDC, and hope to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. This was very useful, and I think all of our three guests now picked up some of the strong points from the process as well, and some of the learnings. And Linda, you already started guiding us somehow through your introduction into the next steps as well. So I appreciate that very much, because you gave us a good introduction to maybe switch to the future now and see what we can expect. The process we learned now was extremely inclusive, comprehensive, very valuable. Some recommendations really important were put at the table, especially having in mind the context as well. I'm just now realizing how many, and you pointed to these things, how many important things in the context were happening, including, Linda, you mentioned this big election year, all of the misinformation, disinformation. Renata, you mentioned ChatGPT and all of the generative AI that somehow coincided with the Global Digital Compact work and the work of the Secretary General's AI Advisory Board. So this is the right momentum. And we all use this momentum to put these recommendations to the table. So what next now? I will bring back now to Renata. We already heard from Linda some of her thoughts. So from somebody who was deeply into the process and leading the process, Renata, what is your ideal vision now? Where do you see the GDC going forward?
Yeah, it's always easy, isn't it, to negotiate, or not easy, but when you've negotiated, everybody gives a big collective sigh of relief. It's over. And then, of course, the question of where and how to go forward. So I'll put forward just a couple of thoughts that I would really like to hear people's feedbacks and thoughts. First, let me say that on any broad document negotiated at a global level, there will be some issues and elements that grab the imagination or political will or their champions as energy around. And there's some issues that will struggle. So I think we should be realistic that in a document that includes aspects from connectivity to digital equality of the economy and their widening opportunities to all the human rights issues, and then the data and the AI sections, there are going to be some sections that seize and mobilize energy, and there will be others less. So it's going to be a shifting speeds, I would say. The second, and I would say that this is something that is very important for OSET and something that I think is very important for the UN. The UN is a platform for taking forward this digital cooperation, and the UN can facilitate many parts of it. But the UN, this is not about the UN. And I think too much of the discussions around the Global Digital Compact were sometimes became very UN-centric, became about which entity leads, which entity drives, no, the UN facilitates actions by governments, by civil society, by a host of other actors, by private sector, technical. I don't think we facilitate, but we can facilitate, like the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So we have that facilitative role. We can help that agenda setting role, as we did in the idea of the Global Digital Compact, and we can help provide the space. But I think we need to be very clear that this is a space that we need others to really lift, and especially in the digital space, where most of the new developments in AI are happening outside of governance structures. That's very different than previous technologies like the nuclear space or the chemical weapons space or the biological space. It's in the private domain much more than in perhaps other technologies that we might have been used to in the 20th century. So we see a range of other actors shaping this space. And I think, therefore, the question is, how can we put in place a decentralized implementation framework that accepts that there are going to be different coalitions of actors, different forces driving some progress, perhaps at a national level, perhaps at a regional level. But it's not going to look like your standard 20th century multilateralism, where every government reports on what they've done in area X. That doesn't mean to say, and I agree with Linda, that we need accountability frameworks, which is why we fought very hard for two aspects. One, an implementation map to even just identify, well, who might be some of those lead drivers, who might be some of those champions at the regional level, in sectors, at the global level. And why we've also pushed for the idea that in the 82nd session, and I think the Secretary General has made it clear he would like to see a periodic review, not just a one-time review, but periodically that we come and we say this space in which developments are happening so fast, in which the technology is moving so rapidly, we need to have a mechanism by which we come by and say, how are we doing? What are the issues we're now facing? I mean, the fact that it took us 20 years to come from WSIS, where we were talking about spam, and then the GDC, where we're talking about Gen AI, just shows you that we need to adapt our governance structures at the multilateral level. So I would love, and I think this is our framework, for the UN perhaps to have a framework, what we're calling tables, for each of the objective areas. They would be open, and UN entities have an obligation and, of course, a commitment to help the implementation in specific action areas. And there will be some that will be well placed to lead. I'll offer an example. Linda, you talked about the information integrity section, which was an important section and which I think does try to push private sector, big tech actors in directions towards greater accountability. But there we need UNESCO and OHCHR from the UN side to be helping to champion some of those actors. But we need then coalitions of actors. In the energy space, we have CODES, which is a coalition of states, non-state actors, UN actors driving environmental issues. We've generation equality in the perspective of gender, digital equality. We have the Digital Public Goods Alliance, where we see Norway and others championing UNICEF as a key actor. Germany's active in this space. So I would love us to see actors and coalitions coming together to lead and commit to specific actions in specific areas. And the UN will provide the framework, the transparency, publish that as a report, provide the mechanism where transparency and information sharing can happen, where some of those coalitions can come together, but not try to drive the process through a top-down. and not try to sort of centralize the process around UN actors or UN entities alone. That's my strong sense of where we need to go. In that, I would just add, I think it'll be really important that we have regional drivers, because Linda's pointed out that, Nigat, you pointed out how different the world looks depending on where you sit. And I don't sit very far away from you, Nigat, at least not geographically. I'm in Delhi. And the world of DPI, the debate on digital public infrastructure, is so different here than the debate on digital public infrastructure in Europe. I mean, it is a lifeline to development that families have never dreamed of otherwise. So we need those regional perspectives, I think, to drive that with the framework that the UN helps provide of that. So I will just say that. And then if I can just stop on the AI, I think we have a unique opportunity, thanks to the work of Nigat and others, to put in place a genuinely participatory AI governance debate. Right now, all the initiatives that are happening, as numerous as they are and as laudatory as many of them are, like the Council of Europe, like the EU AI Act and others, they are not inclusive of the global majority. They're not inclusive of the governments and certainly not the populations of these countries. That is what the UN AI governance framework provides. The AI governance in the independent scientific panel that Nigat said, now the modalities of that will be discussed this year. In fact, starting already. It will be really critical for civil society to be actively engaged in that space, because if not, the likelihood of that becoming tied up with geopolitical rivalries and issues is strong. So we really need to get the voices of civil society in contributing, watching, monitoring that process. And then the second, I would just point to policy dialogue that Nigat and Linda both talked about. That's a really important way for sharing of best practices, for states and actors to say, what are you learning? What are you grappling? To some of that lived experience and emerging tools to be shared. I come from a country, Ireland, which was very late on many social justice issues and human rights development. And whenever we have a citizens' assembly on a policy issue, we tend to draw from a lot of other countries' examples. That's what you do if you're later in the game. So can we have that? And then the third, I did just want to flag, I'm sure, Nigat, you also want to highlight, the AI panel recommended the creation of a global AI fund. Now, the member states did not take up that idea of an AI fund, but what they did instead, they couldn't agree fully on it, but they agreed to ask the Secretary General to present innovative financing options on AI capacity building. In other words, how to level the playing field. Linda's point about how do you address even the AI development if you don't have electricity. And I think there's an opportunity to contribute to that report, to get issues on the table in that report, and to genuinely try to do something that is creative and innovative about how we think about that the capacity building for Global South. So I would say those are the priorities going forward.
Thank you so much, Renata. I quickly picked up one of the quotes from actually the final report of the AI advisory board. Nigat, I will give a floor to you after this, but this is really telling to your words, Renata, as well, how differently all of these existing initiatives are distributed in different regions. And this is the quote that 7 countries are parties to all of the sampled AI governance efforts, 7 prominent non-United Nations initiatives, and 118 countries are parties to none, primarily the countries from the Global South, right? Just this number is telling us so strongly how much the activities that Nigat, your group, is actually recommending are crucial. And I agree with Renata, this is the momentum to provide on some of them in practice. So Nigat, tell us about maybe I frame it a little bit differently for you and ask, how do you see ideally the process looking after a year or 5 years if all of these initiatives are implemented that you suggested? And before you start, just to remind the audience to bring your questions on board as well. Either type them in the chat or ask your question directly. Nigat.
Yeah, I mean, before going to your question, because I also belong to a civil society and the one that is based in Global South, I think this is, as Renata mentioned, it's a huge important moment for us to basically, engage with these processes as CSOs, specifically monitoring and engaging with the International Scientific Panel on AI and the Global AI Dialogue. I think the Global AI Dialogue will give space to civil society from Global South to engage with different stakeholders. But at the same time, I would say Linda mentioned the divides, different divides that we face in the South, and then we see, like those are actually not even issues in the North. And so these divides also contain, not the infrastructural divides, but also what the governments in the South are doing, right? And I think this is also a space to hold different actors accountable, including your own governments. What we are seeing at the moment is also, and we have to be very, very careful, like as civil society, there's always different aspects that we are looking into, that while we are talking about opportunities and governance and regulations and policies, we also, like being in the South, have to be very mindful that what we are presenting to our government, so that in disguise of regulations and governance and bringing policies, they do not start governing actually dissenting voices or human rights defenders. That's what they have been doing when it comes to cybercrime laws, in previous one in last one decade. So I think this is like an opportunity for CSOs to kind of monitor this space and engage with different stakeholders and keep an eye on different powerful actors, including tech companies and governments. With regards to the future steps, I think Renata already mentioned, but with regards to implementation of AI scientific panel, some suggested deliverables that we kind of see is that states share best practices on AI governance, and different stakeholders, basically not just states, and promote common understanding on the implementation of AI governance measures, share voluntary significant AI incidents that stretched or exceeded the capacity of state agencies to respond, discuss international scientific panel on AI reports. This is related to policy dialogue on AI governance. But on international AI scientific panel, what we are expecting as deliverables are annual reports surveying AI-related capabilities, opportunities, risks, and uncertainties, quarterly thematic research digest on areas in which AI could help to achieve the SDGs, and ad hoc reports on emerging AI risks. So these are some of the recommendations, our expectations around deliverables from our recommendations. But just last few points, that we actually gave some more recommendations. Only 2 were accepted principally, but we requested Secretary General to take into account our recommendation on the fund that Renata already mentioned, while developing voluntary financing options for AI capacity building. So GDC also called on standards development organizations to collaborate to promote the development and adoption of interoperable artificial intelligence standards. GDC calls for promoting North-South and South-to-South triangular cooperation to support the development of representative high-quality data sets. And it has been requested that the Secretary General submit a proposal for the establishment of an office in the UN to strengthen the digital cooperation set out in the GDC. So some of the recommendations that didn't land in GDC, we sort of requested SDG to sort of, as Secretary General to sort of, take those into account and see what can be done around that. But I would say that these recommendations that we have again requested to Secretary General to take into account are actually very much relevant to Global South. That's where we kind of see our inclusion and being part of the whole process, in like meaningful inclusion, basically. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nigar. And because we are running out of time, and I want to give the final word to Linda as well, and maybe reflect to the question that we received in the chat on what mechanisms were established to hold governments accountable to the principles outlined in the GDC. And Nigar just pointed to the importance of keeping the stakeholders accountable. Linda, any ideas about this? How we can keep governments accountable, and any last words for the next steps for the implementation of GDC from your side?
Okay, thank you so much. I think the GDC mentions accountability frameworks, and this is the role of digital technology companies and developers to co-develop this industry accountability frameworks. I think that's a good approach to it and looking at it from an industry perspective. But there's always been calls around, you don't leave tech companies to, to be a law unto themselves. I think that there will be more discussions on this, and this is going to be, I think, also a national approach to see what could be done within national, frameworks. But we also see on tech companies, the GDC calls on tech companies and social media platforms to enhance transparency and accountability, especially to algorithms and on content moderation. And also it calls on social media companies and researchers, like to ask them to have researchers to have access to this platform so that then we can be able to, have more data. We've seen in the past previous years, for instance, Twitter, they changed their APIs. Researchers had an easier time scraping off and researching on these platforms. And that's just an example. So it means that we need more transparency to make these particular platforms accountable. But I will say with governments, we need a framework in which civil society can engage. Many countries do not have a framework in which you go to government and get accountable. I think that needs to be done. The UN has done this with ECOSOC, and that has been successful. It needs to get into national frameworks. But I'd also say this. The user has changed, and the role of civil society is really transforming in this day and age. More people are exercising agency. You'd see from the Gen Z protests in Africa, where Gen Zs are going to court, they're going to the streets to demand from accountability from government, rendering civil society is ideally useless in the process. So I think that there needs to be more teaching of resilience from everyday users of the internet, then they can be able to hold these people accountable. I also just want to make a last comment on startups. The GDC mentions the startups, which I think helps us to build alternative centers of power. Because when you have just big tech running companies and entire national digital infrastructure resting on the back of big techs, we have a problem. I think that we must make sure startups have resources, startups ideally have a really conducive environment for them to create and innovate, and then, get them to the next level. Please forgive me. My very last comment will be this. And Renata, you mentioned it. On we have laws that are being made that affect us, but we are not part of this process. And you mentioned the EU AI Act, for instance, which I want to agree that Europe really is keen, because this is, a European lab. Europe is keen on exporting its digital policy. But in exporting its digital policy, especially like we've seen in Africa, Europe has exported its data governance policy. But Africa is not involved. We see from the AI processes now, even including the code of conduct, the process that's going on now, it's not easy as an African to get a point across in these particular platforms. I want to urge us that even as we look for these new frameworks, let's make sure that the policy is actually inclusive, not just technology, but policy is inclusive in every sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You did an impossible to put such a complex topic of GDC and all of these challenges, lessons learned, and ideas for the future in only 1 hour. So a big thank you to our speakers for sharing your insights and expertise. And I also want to express my gratitude to organizers, to the Data Innovation Lab for always being open for important topics like these. And thank you for their hard work behind the scenes for making this event possible.